So the Soviet sleep experiment goes like this. It is the late 1940s. World War II is finally over, and Soviet Union is desperately searching for drugs to enhance their soldiers' endurance. Beneath the layers of Soviet secrecy, there is a classified military experiment that has started, and this one is meant to test the very boundaries of the human mind. You see, they've finally created a chemical compound they believe that can completely eliminate the need of sleep for humans. To test this, they have selected 5 political prisoners. They are locked inside a sealed gas chamber which is airtight and completely isolated. Inside they have 5 cots without any bedding, they have a sink, they have a toilet, they have shelves of dried food supposed to last them for 30 days, and to monitor the people inside they have hidden microphones in the walls. There's also a two-way glass so researchers can actually monitor them around the clock, but there are, well, no cameras. The centerpiece of the experiment is actually the gas. It is a brand new stimulant which is supposedly designed to keep the subjects awake for 30 straight days, and as a reward, well, they are promised their freedom if they can endure it. So at first things go fine. I mean, the prisoners are talking and sharing stories and they're laughing. On the day 5, we first start to see the tone shift. The conversations stop suddenly, and something else, something very creepy takes their place. Whispers. There are like long drawn out whispers into the microphones, not directed at the researchers but supposedly at themselves, and it seemed like they were talking to some other entity as well. On day 9, something else happens. One of the subjects completely snaps. He starts screaming, and screaming at the top of their lungs. They don't stop screaming for hours. Hours go by and he still doesn't stop. He screams so much that his vocal cords, actual physical vocal cords, they tear up and he can't physically scream, and the only sound that comes out is this horrible rasping silence. Well, the others, they don't react at all. Nobody speaks. They just are like watching him. That's it. The very next day, things even get worse. They tear pages from the few books they were given, and using their own feces, they cover the observation window by pasting the pages on the window. From that moment on, the researchers cannot see inside at all. They're completely blind. And a few hours later, they can't hear anything either because supposedly the patients have found the microphones and they have taken them out. And there is this complete and utter silence. The researchers, they start to panic, but they don't go in. It takes 6 more days for them to act. On day 15, they decide to open the chamber. The moment the door opens, there is a thick fog of gas that rolls out. And what they find inside is, well, it's almost beyond description. One of the subjects is dead. The others are alive, but they are barely recognizable. The cots, they had for sleeping, they're completely shredded, and the floor is soaked with water from the broken sink. Like there is 2 feet of water mixed with blood. The food supplies are untouched. Nobody ate in the last 6 days at least. And the subjects, well, the ones that are still breathing, they are missing pieces of flesh. And it's not really violence from the others. All of it seems that these are self-inflicted wounds. There are pieces of skin missing. There are pieces of flesh missing. In fact, they have been tearing at their own bodies. They've taken out their own organs, their own intestines, and laid them neatly on the floor. Looking at their fingers and their hands, researchers also conclude that they've been actually eating their own flesh as well. So the researchers, well, they are horrified and obviously they don't know what to do. And the first instinct is that we need to save them with the help of surgery. So one of them is removed from the chamber and strapped to a gurney. He's completely silent and he is staring as if into a void with their eyes completely locked open. The moment that doctors decide to administer a sedative, he turns and tells them, "Please don't put me to sleep." His voice is hoarse and it's barely audible, but the panic you could feel in his eyes as if sleeping is worse than death. He just begs with everything he has left to stay awake. Another subject, when they're taking him to surgery, he breaks free. He was actually fully restrained with the belts, and yet still he pulls against the strap with impossible strength. You couldn't expect this kind of strength from a person who has like so many injuries and missing organs. There is no screaming, like he does not seem to feel any pain, and this is just raw instinctual resistance, as if sleep was again worse than death. Even the surgical team, they were like military trained. They can't explain that how he was moving like that in his condition. So eventually a lead scientist, he steps in and he leans close to the last surviving subject and asks him, like, because seemingly they were still communicating. Like, he asked them, what are you? And the man, well, you can even call him that, with his disfigured face, and he turns his head slowly and he smiles and he says, we are you. We are the madness that lurks within you all, begging to be set free. And then there's silence, eyes still open, expression completely unreadable, and that is where the story ends. Well, the story first appeared in 2010 on a creepypasta website, which is a website that is dedicated to actually creating fictional horror stories. And since then, the story has been shared and told millions of times. Like, it has been viral for all these years. Just to be clear, this story is completely fictional. However, it's amazing how appealing it is, and I think that its appeal comes from blending of this truth and fiction. It has a narrative that really resonates with anyone who has actually ever experienced sleep deprivation, and that is what makes it so interesting and creepy and viral at the same time. Now, that said, I have a question, and not really that if it ever happened historically, because all the evidence supports that it did not really happen historically. But my question is, could it ever happen? Like, given the limits of the human mind and body, could this scenario ever happen? If all the elements get into place perfectly, can we recreate that? Because whether Soviet sleep experiment ever happened or not, there are two things that will always remain the same: the human body and the human mind. So I want to look at hard science, and then I want to see, is it even possible? Like, what are the limits? What documented incidents do we know where certain elements of the story actually take place? And the reality, well, I can promise you that the reality of that might surprise you. There are three questions I want to answer. Firstly, could you live without sleep for 15 days? Number two, could you descend into the kind of madness that we see in the story? And number three, could you, driven to extreme mental limits, inflict self-harm and perform literally acts of cannibalism on yourself? So let's begin. Let's first start with sleep deprivation. So one of the most notable works on sleep deprivation was actually done in 1983 by Rechtschaffen. So what he did was that he had two groups of rats, one that he kept awake using some gentle stimuli to not let them fall asleep, and the others were also given the same stimuli, but they were allowed to sleep. All the sleep deprived rats started dying after 11 days, whereas the group that was allowed to sleep, well, they survived. The thing is that autopsies revealed no specific single cause of death. Instead, the rats actually showed multi-organ failure. They had like really weakened immune system and really low body temperature despite increased energy expenditure, because don't forget that they were all eating as well. Thing is that this was the first time we saw conclusively that sleep is absolutely essential for life. Prolonged total sleep loss is lethal. Like, it's lethal. Like, you could actually die from not sleeping. And we know that at least in rodents. But you would say, okay, what about humans? So, well, ethically, we can't run an experiment that keeps people awake until they die. But the longest voluntary documented sleepless period comes from a high school student, Randy Gardner, who stayed awake for 264 hours, which is like 11 days in 1964. So he was under observation by Stanford researchers William Dement and John J. Ross. Gardner stayed awake for 11 days as a science fair project, and also he wanted to have a world record attempt. By the 10th day, he was extremely impaired, and by the end, he has experienced like real moodiness and memory lapses and confusion and paranoia and also hallucinations. Ross reported that on day 11, Gardner became unable to complete simple mental tasks. Like, he could not do subtraction, like very, very simple arithmetic tasks. He was also having vivid hallucinations and also delusions. The thing is that once the stunt ended, Gardner slept for nearly 15 hours and, well, he covered surprisingly well. Follow-up examination showed that he had no lasting health damage. The thing is that he did not turn into this like deranged and superhuman figure of the creepypasta. He became paranoid and hallucinated towards the end, but it did not like exhibit aggression and self-harm, the kind that we see in the creepypasta story. So 15 days without sleep is obviously beyond any verified human experience. Well, it is theoretically possible that someone can stay awake this long, maybe with extreme stimulant use or with the help of any medical intervention, and this would push the body and brain past their natural breaking points. By the 2-week mark, a human, and I mean a human, would be delusional, physically incapacitated, or entirely incoherent, meaning they won't be able to form sentences. They won't be orchestrating complex violence or resisting confinement. Like, they would have no tangible brain function to think. That's it. So could a person stay awake for 15 days? Yes, if the artificial conditions are provided. Could they still speak clearly, think logically, or move with purpose? Absolutely not. No. They can still stay awake, but not form any sentences. Okay, now let's look at hallucinations and psychosis, which is like the descent into madness. So if we disregard the gas, there can be 2 reasons why I believe that this madness can happen without sleep. First is the lack of sleep, of course, but the second most importantly ignored in this experiment is the sensory deprivation. So let's first look if sleep deprivation causes hallucinations. So hallucinations are actually false sensory perceptions like seeing, hearing, or feeling things that aren't really there. And research has shown that sleep deprivation is a known trigger for them. The neurological basis lies in how sleep deprivation disrupts the brain's sensory processes and reward system. So when we are sleeping during normal sleep, or especially REM sleep, the brain performs essential maintenance and rebalances our neurotransmitter levels. So without this restoration, neurons become really chaotic and they fire like randomly. They cause spontaneous sensations. It's like having like a projectionist in a cinema has gone mad and he's randomly switching between film reels without making any sense whatsoever. And that is exactly what is happening in your brain. So you remember Randy Gardner, the young guy who took on the challenge to stay awake for 11 days. On day 4, he started having memory lapses and difficulty concentrating. His first hallucination was that there is a street sign who turned into a person, and then it was followed by a delusional episode in which he imagined that he was a famous black football player. There is another famous case actually. In 1959, a DJ, Peter Tripp, decided to stay awake for publicity. Well, yeah, he was Mr. Beast of his time. He stayed awake for 201 hours, and he also started to have hallucinations around the same time, which is the day 4 and 5. He thought, first hallucination, that a drawer was on fire and he saw spiders in his shoes, which obviously weren't there. On his last day, a neurologist was called to examine Tripp before sending him home. When Tripp looked at this doctor, he was wearing his old dark fashioned suit, he had the delusion that doctor was actually an undertaker who was about to bury him alive. He was overtaken with fear and he screamed and he bolted for the door. He could no longer distinguish between reality and nightmare. So if the Soviet sleep experiment story gets one thing right, it's the descent into madness and whispers and talking to unseen figures, because that can completely happen. But the thing is that the coherence of these hallucinations is likely very exaggerated. Sleep deprived people might talk to imaginary voices or react in fear to hallucinations, but the person is extremely confused and disorganized and not really capable of elaborate planning or conversation. You could barely form sentences. So the thing is that the creepypasta subjects actually conversed with the researchers for like 15 days, which is questionable. By this point, like, hallucinations would be completely overwhelming and they would make any normal conversation impossible. Let's talk about the sensory deprivation, because I can promise you this gets really interesting. So the 5 test subjects were not only sleep deprived, but they were actually isolated in a sealed chamber with minimal external stimuli. For days on end, their world was just 4 walls of the chamber. They had a one-way mirror and very little sensory variation. They had no windows, so they had no way to know what the day or the night is. This means that there is another very powerful psychological stressors, sensory deprivation, and I believe it's worse than sleep deprivation. There has been decades of research starting in the 1950s that has shown that sensory and social deprivation can severely disturb the mind, even if you are well slept. Combined with sleep loss, and these effects would be extremely magnified. In 1954, Donald Hebb and his colleagues at the McGill University conducted one of the most famous experiments on sensory deprivation. They were placed in small silent cubicles, volunteers, and they were asked to lie on a bed wearing translucent goggles to diffuse vision to just light, so they couldn't really even see properly without any patterns. They had gloves on their hands so that they have no touch sensation, and and they had even cardboard tubing on their arms to limit any touch. And there was a constant low white noise to mask any sound that you might hear. So they intended to observe them for as long as 6 weeks, and they were all in, these isolated chambers. Most participants could not last more than 2 and 3 days before they became actually mentally stressed and quit. After as little as 48 hours, nearly all subjects experienced really profound cognitive effects and hallucinations. First, they would see pulsing dots and simple geometric patterns that grew into like really complex isolated images and floating in the room. Then it evolved into like these elaborate integrated scenes playing out before the subject's eyes. It's almost like dreaming while you're awake, which is exactly how one participant described it. One participant in this study reported seeing a parade of squirrels marching purposefully across a slowing field, and they were wearing snowshoes and backpacks. And another one saw a bathtub being steered by an old man, and the old man was wearing a metal helmet. I mean, these absurd hallucinations. In one extreme case, and this is all actually documented, one subject encountered a second version of himself in the room. So he and this apparition, or the ghost version of him, began to blend together until he was unable to discern which was which. Heb, who was the researcher, said that it is one thing to hear that Chinese are brainwashing their prisoners on the other side of the world. It is another to find in your own lab that merely taking away the usual sights, sounds, and bodily context from healthy university students for a few days can shake them right down to the base. It can even shake their personal identity, all within 2 to 3 days. The brain craves input. We are deprived of input. It will invent sensations, and the mind will deteriorate. Well, so yeah, the descent to madness, it checks out. And number 3, the most extreme act done during the whole experiment, the act of cannibalism and self-mutilation. So the story describes the subjects eating the flesh of one victim and even consuming their own as well. Please understand that this is an extremely extreme behavior, at least in documented scientific research, even among the most violent or psychotic individuals. Cannibalism in clinical literature is exceedingly rare. However, there is one notable case that was documented in 1999. A 42-year-old male in Venezuela was accused of cannibalistic acts. So he was finally arrested, and he actually admitted to killing and eating parts of like almost 10 individuals over 2 years. This was one case that received really significant media attention in Venezuela, and the patient became known as the people eater, which actually the person happily accepted. He was happy to hear that he was called the people eater. So despite its rarity, there is an actual phenomenon called the Wendigo psychosis in Algonquin cultures. It describes individuals who, in the context of winter famine and in like really intense psychological stress in one particular area, they developed delusions of becoming a cannibalistic monster, the Wendigo. Wendigo is a monster that supposedly eats the flesh of people. But it's important to note that even though Wendigo psychosis is actually known to be a case of cannibalism, it only occurs in people that are already starving or under extreme cultural programming. And it was sort of seen like a fusion of cultural narrative and mental breakdown rather than just sleep loss. So for this experiment, we should ask ourselves, what could drive them to cannibalism? Like, they had no apparent reason. They were not starving. I mean, they had food, so it wouldn't necessarily be for their survival. The only thing that can explain is like profound psychotic delusion. For example, they might believe that their like compatriots are inhuman, or their consuming flesh has some kind of like a bigger purpose. The story mentions that at least one subject has torn out most of their abdominal organs and another had chunks of flesh missing. Could a person ever do that and remain alive for even hours? So the thing is that massive abdominal trauma leads to shock and death within minutes to an hour maximum if it's not treated. So from a purely medical perspective, the fact that the subject who eviscerated themselves was somehow still alive, it's not possible. I mean, adrenaline can indeed allow people to momentarily perform superhuman feats or not immediately feel fatal injuries. I mean, adrenaline can do that, but I mean, there are rare cases of soldiers in battle who have been surviving horrific wounds for a time due to adrenaline, but eventually it's like physiology wins and no one can live long without vital organs or major blood loss. I mean, it's actually impossible. So the story's description of the subjects clawing at each other and eating flesh, it lies at, well, extreme tale of possibilities. Cannibalism is not really a direct effect of insomnia. It would require a perfect storm of insanity. So realistically, by the time they tore each other apart, at least some of the individuals might have already been in a collapsed state. So yeah, I mean, psychosis, entirely plausible. It can happen, but coordinated cannibalistic violence, tearing out their own flesh? No, not at all. What makes the Soviet sleep experiment so gripping and so viral is how seamlessly it blends the disturbingly believable with almost the scientifically impossible. It's almost like a cocktail of like this violence and like sleep deprivation and cannibalism, which is threaded like together with like just enough realism to make you pause and wonder, like, could this actually happen? So, well, we return to the question that we started with. Knowing everything we know about the human body and mind, could this actually happen? I mean, even if someone tried to recreate the conditions, the sealed chamber, the endless monitoring, the deprivation, it all hinges on one impossible ingredient, and that is the gas. It is a gas that lets people stay awake beyond biology. It is a gas that keeps them alert and lucid, and even while they are tearing themselves apart. It is a gas that lets people function even when their organs are lying on the floor. Take that gas away, and what you're left with, I mean, it isn't horror. In reality, it would be just deterioration. There would be no energy for shouting. There would be no strength for resistance, no coordinated violence. It would just be a slow, painful descent into confusion, and then silence, and then death. So no, not without this magical gas. Not in this world, and not with the human body and mind as we know it. But wait, I mean, hold on. There is, however, one thing that, well, not scientific. If it's true, that would completely fill all the holes that science has left in that story. And that would be demonic possession. But yeah, that is a whole another Pandora's box. So I hope you liked the video. And if you have any questions or if you have any suggestions, then you can put them down in the comments below. I think I would really like to have my sleep for tonight. I wish you a good sleep too. I mean, without any nightmares. Take care, and yeah, I'll see you in the next one. Peace.